Denzel Washington stood by the bank window, observing the noise of the city bustling beyond the building's walls. The transparent glass allowed him to see the movements of the passers-by, their hurried steps seemingly endless even at this late hour. He had only a few minutes left to complete an important task. He had come to the bank to withdraw money that would allow him to pay for his apartment and house. It was a routine matter, but with every step inside the bank, his heart beat faster. The cashier behind the counter nodded at him as he approached, and without a word, he handed over his card to process the transaction. Nothing unusual, a quick, emotionless procedure. He was always attentive to details. He knew how important every action was in his life since each day confronted him with new challenges. And now, with the cash already in his hands, it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But at that very moment, he felt a shift in the air behind him. Two police officers approached. One of them clumsily pulled out his badge, while the other stared intently into his eyes. "Mr. Washington, you need to come with us," one of them stated curtly, his gaze unwavering. Denzel didn't immediately understand what was happening. He glanced at the cashier, who didn't react at all. The officer's stares were heavy, more than just observation. There was something deeper. "What's the matter?" he asked calmly, hoping for a quick explanation. The officer replied directly, "It's a standard check. We have reason to suspect the origin of your cash." "But I withdrew it to pay my debts," Denzel replied, still not believing this was happening to him. Meanwhile, the other officer had already taken out his phone and started entering information. Denzel felt his patience beginning to thin, but he didn't let his emotions take over. His entire experience as an actor, as a man who had faced injustice many times, taught him that sometimes the most important thing wasn't the reaction, but the ability to stay calm. "This is nonsense," he said, turning to the officer. "Just check my documents. I've done nothing wrong." The officer stared at him for a few seconds, as if hesitating before pressing a button on his phone. The air in the bank grew heavier, and Denzel could feel all eyes beginning to focus on him. "I understand this is unpleasant," he said, maintaining his composure. "But let's discuss this calmly." Even though it seemed like a misunderstanding at first, he already sensed that it might be more than just a mistake. Now the key was to stay in control and not give in to panic. Words, that's what could change the course of events, even when uncertainty filled the air. This was the moment when Denzel's decisions would determine not only his fate, but also whether he could defend his name despite everything that was happening. Denzel felt his heart begin to beat faster as the police officers exchanged silent signals with each other. One of them, younger, looked more uncertain, but the older one, wearing a maroon cap, held his gaze steady like a rock. "Let's move to the office," the older officer said, gesturing toward a small room behind the bank's walls. "Do I have the right to a lawyer?" Denzel asked, already sensing that the situation was serious. He wasn't new to these kinds of things, even if he hadn't expected trouble of this nature. The officer didn't answer right away, only nodded, indicating the door leading to the office. The tension hung in the air, and even Denzel could feel the pressure building on his vulnerable spot. This wasn't an ordinary situation. He didn't appear suspicious in any way, yet more and more people in the bank were starting to look at him with curiosity. A whisper seemed to float in the air, even among the voices of passers-by, continuing to weave through the city sidewalks. Why him? And what exactly was wrong with this situation? He didn't believe in coincidences like this. Inside the office, another officer was waiting, a young man with dark eyes who seemed to be watching him a little too closely. "Sit down," the officer said, pointing to a chair across from the table. Denzel sat down, trying to stay calm. The warm light from the lamps overhead made the atmosphere even more tense. He was ready for anything, but this all seemed so absurd. He had simply withdrawn money to pay his usual bills. That's it. The older officer sat down next to him and carefully began asking questions. "Washington, How long have you been in the city? Denzel nodded. A few years. I work as an actor. You've probably seen me on screen. The younger officer glanced at the older one, then looked back at Denzel, as if hesitating. He clearly wasn't convinced that this was all just a misunderstanding. Denzel could feel it, and he could even see the officer trying to confirm his doubts somehow. We received a report about suspicious activity. Your large cash withdrawals have drawn attention. We have reasonable grounds to suspect that you may be involved in financial fraud. That's ridiculous. Denzel couldn't believe what he was hearing. You think I'm involved in fraud? I'm just an ordinary man trying to pay for my house and apartment. But even his voice lacked the confidence he was used to wielding in similar situations. This was a different world, a different reality, where he was now a suspect, even though he had no idea why this was happening. The younger officer picked up his phone and dialed number, clearly weighing his doubts once more. He seemed reluctant to link Denzel to anything serious, but his gaze left little room for doubt. You have the right to remain silent. However, we have the right to question you and clarify the details, the older officer said, his voice calm but firm. I haven't stolen from anyone, Denzel replied shortly, feeling his patience starting to crack. If you want to verify something, just check my documents. This is all a misunderstanding. One of the officers made a note on a tablet. Perhaps it is. The older officer paused briefly. But in cases like this, it's better to be careful. Several minutes passed, but the situation wasn't improving. The suspicion was growing, and Denzel felt more like a target than a man caught up in an unfortunate situation. The pressure was mounting, but he knew that his future and how this city would view him depended on how he handled this moment. He spoke again, trying to maintain his calm. Maybe you're mistaken, and I really hope this gets resolved quickly. But please, don't turn this into a drama when it's really so simple. The officers exchanged glances, and the older one took a step back. All right, he said. We'll let you go if everything checks out clean. But this isn't over. We'll continue our investigation. Denzel felt a wave of relief, but he wasn't entirely sure that this chapter was closed yet. Denzel left the office, still struggling to understand why the situation felt so strange. He noticed how the police officers kept watching him, their gazes piercing into his back. He walked down the hallway, trying to appear calm, but his nerves were already on edge. That same evening, when he got home, his phone rang. The name of the detective he had spoken to earlier appeared on the screen. Denzel felt a chill creep over his skin. He already knew what this meant. We found some inconsistencies. The detective's voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. We received information that you may have been involved in a major financial fraud. It's not a coincidence that you've been withdrawing large sums of cash so frequently. Denzel felt panic rising inside him. He couldn't understand how this was happening. His hands trembled, but he pulled himself together. I don't know what you're talking about. I was just paying my bills. This isn't true. The detective went silent for a few seconds. But here's what we found, he continued. We reviewed your financial transactions and found several suspicious anomalies. Specifically, large sums of money were transferred through one of your cards to offshore accounts. Denzel tried to deny it, but the detective cut him off. We also discovered documents linking you to individuals who have been under surveillance for a long time. This doesn't look like a coincidence. Every word from the detective hit Denzel like a thunderclap. He sat in the darkness of his room, completely shocked. He tried to imagine who could have set him up and how they had been able to track him so precisely. This is a setup, he whispered. I had nothing to do with this. You'll have to prove that, the detective said coldly. Otherwise, we'll have no choice but to take further action. A few hours later, there was a knock at his door. Denzel didn't have time to brace himself for another blow when the police stormed into his apartment. He was taken into custody, and that was the moment he realized the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Several days later, after the investigation, all the facts became clear. At the very moment Denzel had been trying to avoid financial trouble, he had unknowingly fallen into the hands of scammers. One of them, an old acquaintance, had used his personal information to mask large financial transactions through Denzel's bank cards. He hadn't even known about it. But that didn't stop the investigation. The evidence was overwhelming. His card number had been used, and now it looked like he was the one behind the illegal transactions. At the trial, things got even worse. Denzel no longer had clear evidence of his innocence. The case had been constructed so tightly that even his lawyer couldn't uncover traces of the fraud. Every detail pointed directly at him. When the verdict was handed down, Denzel realized this was the end of the life he once knew. It didn't matter how many times he tried to prove his innocence, his past connections, his frequent large cash withdrawals. All of it had sealed his fate. Denzel found himself behind bars. He was stunned by how quickly and mercilessly his life had changed. All he could do was ask himself, could he have done something differently? Could his life have taken another path if he had asked the right question or refused to get involved in the game? Denzel sat in the back of the police car, speeding toward the courthouse. His hands were bound with handcuffs, and his heart pounded in his chest as if it were trying to break free. He couldn't believe it had come to this. The peaceful evenings of yesterday, when he didn't have a care in the world, now seemed like a distant illusion. Through the window, he saw the city rushing by, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The details played over and over in his mind. Offshore accounts, unexplained transactions, secret connections. He couldn't grasp how it had all happened, but one fact remained: he was being accused. The car stopped in front of the courthouse. The officer sitting next to him got out first and opened the door. Denzel felt trapped. As he approached the courthouse doors, he noticed a crowd of reporters and cameras. It was hard to process how things had escalated so quickly, but he knew this was his reality now. Inside the courtroom, it was silent. Every gaze was fixed on him. The judge, strict and unwavering, announced the start of the hearing. Denzel Hart, accused of financial fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, the judge said, reviewing the case file. Denzel braced himself for the difficult fight ahead. His lawyer, experienced and composed, had done everything possible to gather facts in his defense. But even she looked uncertain when new evidence emerged. The prosecutor began his statement, laying out all the evidence that pointed to Denzel. He spoke about the transactions, the forged documents, the money flowing through offshore accounts. All of it seemed to confirm Denzel's guilt. This man had access to significant funds and used them for personal gain. The documents confirm his involvement in a series of illegal operations. We cannot allow people like this to escape justice, the prosecutor said, looking at Denzel with disdain. But Denzel couldn't sit quietly any longer. His lawyer tried to argue that many of the transactions could have been carried out without Denzel's knowledge, that he had been a victim of a sophisticated financial scheme. But there was no concrete evidence in his favor. His phone calls, emails, and financial news subscriptions all painted a picture that was difficult to dispute. When it was Denzel's turn to speak, his voice was low and shaky. He tried to explain that he had no knowledge of these operations, that he had been misled by unreliable acquaintances. But his words didn't carry the weight he had hoped for. The courtroom was stunned when the prosecutor presented new evidence directly linking Denzel to several financial schemes. The evidence included messages with individuals connected to illegal financial dealings. The judge listened carefully to all the arguments and began to make his conclusions. Denzel felt his heart race faster, but his expression remained cold. Finally, after several hours of deliberation, the judge announced the verdict. Denzel Hart, you have been found guilty on all charges. The court deems your actions deliberate and intentional. You will face punishment for your crimes. The courtroom fell silent, and everyone could hear the heavy pounding of Denzel's heart as he heard the verdict. This was his reality. Losing everything he once had because of a few careless decisions, because he had walked into a trap he couldn't escape. When the judge announced the verdict, the courtroom fell silent, and all eyes were fixed on Denzel. His heart was barely beating from the tension, as the verdict seemed inevitable. However, before the judge could deliver the final ruling, Denzel's lawyer suddenly spoke up. "Your Honor, I request that you carefully reconsider the latest testimony," the lawyer said, seemingly stepping out of the shadows for the first time during the entire trial, trying to turn the situation around. "We have received new documents and information that change the entire picture of this case." The judge looked at the lawyer and nodded, allowing him to continue. The lawyer stood and addressed the court. "The latest testimony indicates that all the illegal transactions were not only carried out without my client's knowledge, but were orchestrated by specific individuals who were trying to shift all the blame onto him. We have new evidence proving that Denzel was set up and became the victim of a criminal syndicate that manipulated his name to cover up their own crimes." The courtroom remained silent. Following the lawyer's words, new evidence emerged. A series of recorded phone conversations between some of the key figures in the case, in which they discussed plans to use Denzel as a scapegoat for their crimes. This was the turning point. These records, which had previously been overlooked, confirmed that Denzel was not involved in the financial schemes he had been accused of. The prosecutor hesitated for a moment, but quickly composed himself and tried to argue that the recordings could be fabricated. However, Denzel's lawyer, not giving him a chance to interrupt, presented new testimony. Witnesses who had seen the actual perpetrators manipulating evidence and documents to shift the blame onto an innocent man. The judge listened closely to this new evidence, while the prosecutor, out of arguments, nervously shuffled through his papers. The latest information presented to the court forced the panel to reconsider the previous ruling. After a short break, the judge returned to the courtroom. Everyone waited for the new decision. A few minutes later, the judge spoke. "Based on the new testimony and evidence, and considering the possibility that my client was framed, I have reached a decision. Denzel Hart is found not guilty on all charges. He was set up, and all accusations against him are hereby dismissed." Denzel heard these words and couldn't believe his ears. All this time, while he was in custody, the thought of his innocence had seemed like a distant hope, but now everything had changed. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, and his heart, which had long lost hope, started beating again. The lawyer, smiling, raised his hand, and Denzel, still surrounded by police officers, was granted permission to walk free. Everyone present, including the journalists, began whispering among themselves. But the only thing Denzel could focus on was the fact that he was innocent. He had won, but he still couldn't believe it. Denzel stood before the court, feeling the wave of emotions gradually recede, leaving behind only the bitterness of what he had endured. He still couldn't believe it was over. When the judge declared him innocent, his heart had raced faster than ever, but his thoughts remained blurry, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. The officers standing next to him looked as though they were ready to take him back into custody, but the order for his release had already sounded through the courtroom. His lawyer was approaching with a smile, and while it should have been reassuring, Denzel felt only exhaustion. "It's over," the lawyer said as they walked out of the courthouse. "I told you this would be resolved." They couldn't hide the truth. "You did the right thing by staying calm and not lashing out." Denzel nodded silently, but his gaze was distant, lost deep in his thoughts. He was trying to process his feelings. The relief of being acquitted was mixed with the lingering anxiety of having had a criminal identity forced upon him. His mind drifted back to the moment when he saw the officers arrest him at the bank. He remembered every detail, every glance, every movement, as if someone had recorded the moment on camera. Why him? Why was he the one they chose? They got into his lawyer's car, which was waiting for them outside the courthouse. The tension in the car was palpable, But Denzel's face remained calm as he tried to regain his inner balance. "It's all behind you now," the lawyer continued, addressing him. "Now you can focus on rebuilding your reputation. You need to get back to a normal life." Denzel stared out the window as the scenery blurred past. His thoughts drifted through all the days when his name was in every newspaper, when he felt abandoned, forgotten, even betrayed. His life hadn't just changed, it had become a public tragedy. How was he supposed to put it all back together? "You know," Denzel said quietly, his voice slightly trembling under the strain that lingered inside him, "I'm not sure I want to go back to who I was before. All of this. It's left a mark on me, and now I'm not sure I can ever be that person again." The lawyer glanced at him, smiling slightly, but it was a smile of understanding, not just a professional response to a client. "You don't have to be the same person," he said. "You have the right to change your path, to start fresh. Now you have the chance." Denzel remained silent. The lawyer's words didn't bring instant relief, but they left a spark of hope within him. As he stepped out of the car, he looked around. The city still looked familiar, but at the same time, strangely foreign. What once was just a part of his life now felt like a distant shadow, and he, like someone who had survived his own nightmare. What now? But one thing had become clear. He wasn't alone. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for his right to be heard and understood. And if even a small step in this story had changed his fate, maybe the next steps would change his life. Denzel stared at the dark sky, where the last traces of the day still lingered. He stood on the threshold of his new life, which was just beginning after the heavy trial. The street was empty, with only a few cars passing by, leaving a cloud of dust behind. Everything around him seemed calmingly quiet, even though his heart still carried a heavy stone. Thoughts swirled in his head. Was this real freedom? Had he really won? It seemed as though he had been set up, and only now did he feel free. But could he really forget such experiences? His name was still on everyone's lips, and society has a way of quickly forgetting who is right and who is guilty. But there was one thing. He was no longer just an accused in a criminal case. He was someone who had endured this difficult path. And that feeling gave him a certain strength. "You're a real hero," said the lawyer, approaching him as they stepped out onto the street. "You've been through a lot, but you didn't break." Denzel looked at him and smiled for a moment, but he found it hard to accept the praise. "I don't know if I feel like a hero. I'm just trying to figure out what to do next." The lawyer paused, realizing that there was more in those words than just doubt. "You're not alone, Denzel. There are people who are ready to support you if you want it. And believe me, this experience won't pass without leaving a mark. You're changing, and that's okay." Denzel looked back at the sky, where the stars began to appear one by one, trying to find their place in the vast darkness. He felt like he had been reborn, but in a different world, with different rules and a new sense of loneliness. "I want to do something meaningful," he said quietly, more to himself than to the lawyer. "I can't just go back to what was." The lawyer looked at him attentively, his voice softening. "You've already taken a big step, Denzel. And the best thing you can do now is decide who you want to be tomorrow. The choice is yours." And though Denzel didn't have a clear answer to that question, he felt that the first steps had already been taken. His struggle didn't end with the acquittal in court. It had only just begun. And even though everything around him was filled with doubts and fears, he knew that now he had a chance to start a new chapter. Now it was important to make the right choice, to find himself in this new world, and not let the past take hold of him again. Denzel stood on the threshold of a new life, but he didn't know what awaited him ahead. The court case that had nearly destroyed him now seemed like just a small part of a larger, more complex mosaic of his existence. With every step, he felt a new chapter unfolding, not just a cleansing of the label guilty, but a true chance for rebirth. Some people saw his victory as a mere coincidence. Others admired how he had held himself together during that time. But for Denzel, This was just the beginning. He decided that he could no longer be a passive observer in his own life. Emerging from the darkness of suspicion and misunderstanding, he chose to take a step toward action. He began working with various community organizations, fighting for the rights of others who had also been unjustly suspected or accused. It was difficult, as the memories of what had happened to him still haunted him. But with every new step, he felt himself gaining strength. If this was his path to inner cleansing, he decided to walk it with dignity. A few months after his acquittal, Denzel sat in a small cafe, talking to his former lawyer, who had now become his friend. "You found your way," the lawyer said, watching as Denzel pondered his next steps. Denzel smiled, looking out the window where the faint drizzle misted the glass. "You can't always see the result right away. But I don't think about what's been lost anymore. I think about how to help others. I see that change starts with us." And in that moment, amid the noise of the city, he felt that his struggle, though not over, was changing him and the world around him. He wasn't a hero in everyone's eyes, but he was a hero to himself, a person who had been able to change the situation by not giving up, but choosing the path of dialogue and mutual understanding. And though the future remained unpredictable, he knew that today's step could be the beginning of a great change. And that change had already started with him.